Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The Institute for North American and European Studies at the University of Tehran, as well as the Shahid Beheshti School of Governance, asked me to chair a session with three very esteemed guests. And I, of course, was very excited about doing this because the three guests are three of the best commentators that I know of who could discuss the current events in the United States, the situation and the developing situation in the United States, and the relationship between what's going on in the United States and our part of the world, as well as the world at large. So for this session, we've invited Alastair Crooke, who is a former British diplomat, an EU envoy, and also the director of Conflicts Forum. And I've participated in many of his programs, which have always been excellent. Pepe Escobar, who is a geopolitical analyst and an author who writes very often for Asia Times, and he is also a person who's traveled across the world extensively. Not only does he know our region well, but also Latin America. And Max Blumenthal, who is the editor of Grayzone.com, and I also I read the material that all three of our guests write regularly, and I also view their interviews, and it's always a learning process for me, and I'm very grateful that they accepted, all three of these good friends have accepted the invitation. So I'll just give a brief introduction to what we want to talk about, and then each of you will speak for 7, 8, 10 minutes, up to you. If you need to speak a bit longer, or if you want to keep it short, it's up to you, and then we'll have a conversation. So what I want to know personally is that what's going on in the United States. I know that very few people, relatively speaking, predicted what has happened already. But we've in the private conversations that I and people in this panel have had in the past, we know that this was not completely unexpected. If you read articles written by my colleagues in the panel, you'll know that actually what happened in the United States on January the 6th and what's been happening since then was not unexpected. And we've been discussing the possibility for this situation and these events for the last few months amongst ourselves. But what I want is for Alastair, Max, and Pepe to give their take on what is going to happen now. I don't mean predictions, but a general idea of where things are going, because no one can predict the future, but we can understand what's happening and thus assess certain things about the future. So if it's okay, I'll begin with you, Alastair, and then we'll move on to Max and Pepe. What's going on?
Thank you very much, Mohammad. As you rightly say, we're in a period of a great deal of turmoil, and it's very hard to say where things are going to go. So where are we now? I think we find ourselves, or at least, and when I use we, I'm really talking about the sort of Western sphere, and not just the United States, but specifically in the United States. Again, it applies to Europe, but I think we're in a dynamic that is almost irreversible. Well, in fact, more than one dynamic, two dynamics. The first dynamic is basically the aftermath of 2008. When in the aftermath of that financial crisis, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury decided to kick the can down the road by moving to zero interest rates and also quantitative easing. Quantitative easing basically means money printing, effectively to buy American debt instruments. When they moved to that point, they really set the scene for throwing one sector of the American population under the bus, as I put it. Because really it was a huge transfer of purchasing power to another sector. Another sector, it has produced incredible inequalities of wealth by that act. It has made saving almost impossible. I think we may go on to it in a little while, but when we look at what was been happening with the GameStop exercise in Wall Street, many of these people have been saying, look, you know, what can I do? If I spend nothing, if I do nothing, buy myself nothing, I don't get married, I am economical, I avoid any pleasures or any adventures, maybe in 65 years I'll be able to buy an apartment. In a sense, this young millennial generation, this not only are there no jobs at the moment, or far fewer jobs, and all of course this has been exacerbated by the coronavirus. There are no jobs, but it's really, they are desperate. I mean, the financial situation of these young people, they are betting what they call their stimmy money, which is their stimulus that they got from the federal authorities, $600 or something. They're betting it and trying to make some money to compensate for the fact that otherwise they're broke, that they can't afford to pay the rent and they can't afford to live. So one sector of the population, I mean, and I'm talking about a large sector. I don't mean a small sector. I'm talking about at least 60, maybe more of the population is in the sector. Now, what I would say also is the U.S. economy has changed completely. The idea of the original, the economy of opportunity, anyone can become a millionaire, anyone can become president, is over. The economy has changed out of all recognition. It's no longer a market economy. It's actually a state-run economy run by the Federal Reserve and the Treasury. There is no price discovery in markets. You can't talk about the fundamental value of any share or any company because there's no price discovery. There's been huge asset inflation for those who own assets during this period. And the economy has really become something of an oligarchy. We've seen the destruction of small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and the concentration of wealth in monopolistic oligarchies, increasingly powerful politically, who have links with Wall Street, and Wall Street has links with them and with the Silicon Valley. And it's become a huge nexus of power that really exercises almost complete dominance in the political sphere as well as the economic sphere now. So this is one aspect of it. Then I think the second dynamic, which again is like a sort of tunnel leading down to the inevitable. Because in the first one, what I mean by that is there's no longer any way of going back to the old economy, a real market economy, the capitalist economy. The only way ahead, basically, is for the Federal Reserve to take this modern monetary theory, it's not a theory, it's not modern, but to take the money printing, the asset purchasing to its extreme. Go all the way with it, flood it with money, flood it with enough money to keep interest rates down, and just go until something breaks. And something will break, but none of us know when it will break. But it's a wig in terms of the economy and in the politics, in a sense, we've got to this process where as complex networks become bigger and bigger and more complex, so the elements of risk and so the vulnerabilities in the economy and in the politics become more profound. It's like I always make a link to sort of sandcastles. You know, you go on with the sandcastle and suddenly you get a cascade of problem arriving. sometimes it may be what we've just seen in the markets in last week, it may not, but that will be what I'm talking about. We go on with the monetary theory until something breaks in the complex structure, which has become so interrelated, so complex, that its risks and its vulnerabilities have just increased. And then again, in the cultural era, it's more complicated. But what I think is the second dynamic, which is very striking, is that we've moved now to a cultural paradigm, or moving to a cultural paradigm at present, whereby the old idea of Americans that they, were rugged individualists, were people who were made their own fortunes. Famous American author Walter Russell Mead wrote a book about this and said basically, Mohammad will remember him well from having met him with us in Beirut, wrote a book really saying, this individual, this Protestant ethic, both in Britain and in America, this individualism was the source of American power. In other words, this is what made America great again. In the myth, if you call it, the narrative of the Americas that believe in the founding ethos. Well, this new cultural paradigm that is coming in with the emphasis on equity rather than equality, the emphasis on equity actually implies positive discrimination against those individualists, against white Americans, to pay, to atone for what was done to them in previous generations, for the disadvantages, for the, if you like, the sacrifices that other races had to suffer in previous generations. But if you accept present discrimination, it means you're subordinated. It means you're second class. It means you should be removed from certain positions, from jobs in the universities, and accept a subordination and a permanent discrimination. This is, I think, the second. We're moving inevitably because Wall Street, tech, big tech, silicon, everyone is pursuing this new politics of identity, of equity, and of compensation for past racial justice to the extreme. And if it's pursued to the extreme, it again, in a cultural way, just overwhelms the cultural values of America, kicks them under a bus, basically, and leaves them under the bus. So I don't want to take up time. So I say, where is all of this leading? My sense is, but I look forward to hearing from Pepe and Max, because Max is the closest to occupied Grayzone, maybe even living in it. But I feel that for the time being, we're probably entering into something of a hiatus. Because really, I mean, the lockdown through big tech, through the removal of accounts, anything you say, and then the transformation of big tech into the arm of intelligence as part of the new war on domestic terrorism, with Facebook saying that they'll provide all the details that they can to the security services in America not about who was in the Capitol on the 6th of January, but who might be supporting Trump in some way, who might have been at the rally at which he spoke. I mean, so I think it's going to be very difficult. These are old counter-insurgency techniques. Cut off the communication, cut off the leadership from communicating with the base. Well, Trump has been cut off from his base, for sure. Then the base has been divided up and dispersed over as many platforms as possible, and then had their accounts crushed. Even the little Reddit traders in Wall Street are having their accounts crushed. Google has cancelled something like 150,000 comments on Robinhood, the brokerage firm, and other things. I think it's going to be very hard for Red America, if I can call it that, really to regroup in these conditions, to mobilize, to communicate even very easily. How do they communicate? Everything. Some of them tried moving to Parler, another platform that was the rival, which many conservatives tried to move to. That was shut down. Where do you go? All of these things make it very difficult, I think, to see a real mobilization. And the other thing, and perhaps Max will comment on it more, because I just feel one of the striking things that we see at the moment is that, there's no structure left. I mean, the Republicans are in disarray in the House, in the Senate, the leadership at odds with the grassroots. And where's the structure? I mean, it did seem that, Trump, at the end of the election, seems to have been completely taken by surprise, even though it was set out in the Transition Integrity Project's report, exactly what was planned and what was happening. But then it was never followed up with, if you like, daily, there was no war room to put out what evidence they felt they had, a fraud or anything like that. It was never coherently put. There was no real ability to sort of take this forward. So my question would really be, is the structure going to come into being? I suspect that, and that's why I call it a sort of hiatus of calm that may last for a little while until new structures and new leadership perhaps can emerge, or with Trump or without Trump, whatever is the situation. He's certainly not going away. Is that going to be possible? I think it will take time. In which case, the driver of events will not be, if you like, the slow accumulation of, if you like, mobilization on the part of Red America, but events. And I think it's events that can actually trigger the change. Unexpected, the unknown unknowns suddenly bursting onto the scene, either in terms of a market crash or a problem with the dollar, the devaluation, continuing devaluation of the dollar, something like that, I think will probably suddenly transform the situation, rather than we'll see perhaps the sort of mobilization, actually taking a concrete form and being able to push back. Events may actually anticipate it much further. And I just draw on one of the things I've used before and said before, Mohammad is aware of it, is what happened in Russia with the Yeltsin election, the last Yeltsin election, and I'm not making a comparison with the United States for anyone on Twitter who's listening or anything. I am saying that was clearly a stolen election. Everyone knew it was a stolen election by Yeltsin. Actually, by many of the same people and the same techniques that we have seen claimed today. And immediately after that, there wasn't a change. It didn't. Actually, the Russian special forces would not take action, even though they were ordered to do that. And then there was a pause after that, really until the economic crisis in Yugoslavia came about, and the Yugoslavian political crisis. Then the army went in and said politely to Mr. Yeltsin, listen, I think you better step down, or otherwise you may be arrested and find yourself in jail. So I think my point here is not to say that this is a direct comparison with the United States, or this is what's going to happen in the United States, but I'm just saying that so often in these things, after an event of an election which is disputed by a substantial proportion of the population, you have a sort of period of calm until events take over, and then bang, it sort of starts to change. Mohammad, I'll stop there, if that's okay.
Well, so we'll move on, Max, and then we'll go to Pepe. But just a couple of things that I just wanted to repeat about what Alastair said that I thought were important, and maybe add one or two points as well. And that is that Alastair sort of alluded to the death of the American dream. And I think that that's exceptionally important because in countries where people have historically lived in poverty, for whatever reason, colonization, mismanagement, whatever, people are used to, generation after generation, they're used to living under harsh circumstances, social injustice, and I think the incentive for change, or it probably takes a bit more to make people angry, because when you're used to something, it's the norm, and therefore it's more difficult to sort of lit a flame to ignite some sort of explosion. But the United States, which historically has had a very powerful middle class, and where older people still remember the United States being the most powerful country in the world with the best infrastructure, where it had a huge middle class. Extreme poverty existed, but I mean, for the majority of Americans and American workers who worked in factories, they could live a relatively decent life and send their kids to college, but that no longer exists. And I think that makes the United States different from some countries whose previous generations lived in poverty as like the current generation. So this mass movement of wealth since 2008, from bottom to top, this transfer of wealth from the middle class to the super wealthy, I'm wondering what dynamics will come into play as a result. I think over the last few days, what Alastair alluded to, Robin Hood, that's one such example. But I'm wondering, is it just red America, or is it also blue America? Because if the markets, if there's hyperinflation, or if there is continued decline of the 60%, let's say at least, that could create great anger and hostility on both the left and the right, among progressives as well as Trump supporters. And will that lead to some sort of political fragmentation? If it does, what does that mean? These are just a couple of questions that I had.
Can I just say quickly, because I don't want to budge in on what Max and Pepe want to say, but I think actually what you said is something that we need to develop further, because I think actually the global implications of the mask being pulled from the face of American democracy, to see, we've seen for some time that sort of liberalism has been a god that's failed, and now democracy has been seen to be a god that failed, and we see very clear evidence of that in Europe, in the European Union, who are really terrified and say, we cannot, we won't survive as a European Union if there's no perception, no umbrella of democracy. So I think that's what you said was really important. And obviously, what were the Robin Hood traders doing? They were just showing that actually the market is rigged and the economic system is rigged against them. And the rigging became, suddenly the mask was blown away, and you could see the whole system moving to reinforce the position of the big hedge funds and the interests of Wall Street in the proposal, and telling their little Reddit followers, look, you can't even trade or even close out your positions, you just have to take the losses that you're coming. I mean, this really, I think these things have major external implications. But I mean, back to the United States. Sorry for that.
Yeah, so after Robin Hood, Max, I think it shows that not only is there for all to see great, the system is rigged, but after Robin Hood, they even rigged it further. And I think that itself is another reason for further antagonism amongst the American public. So there's not only the blue and the red, or the left and the right, but more importantly, I think, it's becoming a class struggle. But I'm not quite sure if the left and the right are willing to see each other in that light. Yes, Max, sorry.
No, that's a great transition point. And Alastair left a lot of questions. I mean, I had planned actually to touch on many of the same issues that he covered, and I'll try to address some of the questions that he raised and that you raised, Mohammad. And thanks again for organizing this forum. The timing couldn't be better. We're in the last day of January, and this is a month where it felt like the decline that we've been witnessing, especially in the Trump era of a global empire, has accelerating to the point where, sorry, I have a cat here who's being really annoying, is really accelerating. And there are two events, as Alastair mentioned, which have illustrated this acceleration. I think the issue is very structural here. It isn't about personalities, although Trump's personality certainly lifted the mask and revealed him to be a uniquely American president. Biden's role will be to sort of put the mask back on. Hold on, I have to throw a cat out because she's being really annoying.
Don't worry about it.
She wants to jump up on my desk in front of the camera. She's really a diva.
We
She's
could
a
have
huge narcissist.
her.
Yeah, I'll show her to you during Q&A. We'll bring her back on. But she's really she's a beautiful cat, and she loves being on camera. But this is my time, and I'm not going to be showed up. But we have Biden coming in pledging to really restore America's soul. He uses Reagan-esque language. Building America Back Better was Boris Johnson's campaign slogan. The World Economic Forum uses this slogan. And Biden also talked about kind of when he was inaugurated, the theme was unity and a kind of morning in America. Morning in America was Reagan's campaign slogan. And unity, what Biden means is not a unity between right and left against common foes of exploitation and inequality, but a unity between transatlantic elites against the threats to the political consensus, the establishment consensus, and warding off those threats through coercion and manipulation and even force, and restoring control internationally. Biden has consistently used that language. And the events in the past month have showed that Biden's pledge to restore control and administer unity and salvage America's soul, which is essentially American exceptionalism, are illusory. His quest to do this is really delusional because of the structural contradictions that are being exposed. January 6th was, of course, a seminal event, and I was there because I live 15 minutes from the U.S. Capitol, which is now under military occupation. And if you've seen the video that's careening around the internet of Syrians in northeastern Syria picking through garbage dumps in front of oil wells occupied by U.S. troops and their Kurdish partners from the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, you might think, well, that is exceptional to Syria, but this is what you see on Capitol Hill with a very poor black population being pushed out by affluent people who work on the Hill. You often will see homeless people picking through the trash in front of a fortified zone. And so it does remind me of home when I see those images in a unique way. Of course, the violence is not as extreme. This is all the result of an overreaction to intelligence and military failure on January 6th to hold back a sector of the American population that is now seen as a key national security threat. The Capitol was stormed by Trump supporters after Donald Trump declared that the election had been stolen from him. And he convened a massive rally of Trump supporters from around the country on the National Mall to stop the steal on the day that the election was being certified. This whole event was a commentary on American democracy or the lack thereof, and this is something that that no one outside of Trump's realm is willing to say, which is that Trump could not have created the appearance of a stolen election without our phony democracy in the form of our electoral college, and the fact that the election was ran in a terrible fashion, in a way that would never be possible even in a Latin American country where coups take place. The votes all came in late for Biden, very late at night after Trump was way ahead, and it counted in a way in the states which makes little sense to people outside of the U.S. because the person with the most votes does not automatically win. So how many votes you get in certain areas and swing states is what you're waiting for. And Trump created this impression that because these votes just simply came in late, that the system was rigged against him because it looked like he had won the election. So you have all these people in D.C., tens of thousands of people who are fired up. There was a plan in advance to storm the U.S. Capitol. Many of these people who stormed the Capitol are U.S. veterans. I could see them rappelling up the Capitol walls. They were completely fearless in the face of the very sparse Capitol Police that were on the scene. They were impervious to tear gas. Many of them were. And they basically frightened members of Congress into escaping to another building. I don't think any member of Congress was ever directly threatened or harmed. They smashed up the Capitol. The Capitol Police shot one woman who was a former a military veteran, and that kind of pushed the mob out. And so I don't think there was a real threat to, of like the mass lynching of legislators. There was a clownish, absurd dimension to the entire riot. I was mildly amused by the whole scene, to be honest. And and having covered Venezuela and Nicaragua and the coups and right-wing riots that have taken place there, which have been supported with full diplomatic support from the U.S. State Department, and seeing the violence that was meted out. Sorry.
Well, Libya too.
Libya. I mean, Libya was, but my own personal experience, I was in Nicaragua at the end of a coup attempt, which consisted of months and months of nationwide terror carried out by right-wing and criminal mobs across the country, where police stations were surrounded for literally months and firebombed consistently. Police officers were burned in the streets, dragged from trucks. Common supporters of the Sandinista party, regular people, were tortured in their homes, had their homes burned. And we saw the same thing in Venezuela with the Guarimbas. And these are two countries that I've covered. Libya, I haven't been there, but we know what happened there. I mean, this went beyond right-wing riots, or you had the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, an al-Qaeda affiliate that was supported by the U.S. to ultimately assassinate Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi, and sodomize him with a bayonet and take trophy photos with his corpse. So we've seen this across the globe. We saw it in Iran, the U.S. supporting violent riots where police stations were attacked for the past several years. Ukraine, the Maidan coup, which was known as the Revolution of Dignity. This is the U.S. fully supporting, instrumentalizing, and even initiating a coup that relied heavily on far-right muscle from Right Sector, a essentially neo-Nazi organization that became the Azov Battalion, a National Guard unit of the Ukrainian military fighting in the Donbass region with arms supplied by the U.S. Pentagon. So as I was at the Capitol, I saw photos. I was outside the building, and I saw photos from earlier of the QAnon shaman. This was a shirtless man with a Viking helmet and a painted face and a cape on, who represented a conspiracy movement, a pro-Trump online conspiracy movement, who had broken into the heart of Congress, stood at the podium of the Speaker of the House and screamed freedom. And I said, now, if a foreign government, a powerful foreign government, had recognized this man as interim president of the United States, then Americans would know how Venezuelans feel about Juan Guaido. So I saw so many similarities between these instances, these regime change operations that we covered, and what we saw on January 6th. But Americans who exist in this this psychological state, political state of exception, were unable to reflect on their support for these very same events and their repulsion with what was taking place at the Capitol. As a result of this event, which ended by about 6 p.m. in a storm of tear gas, with people marching out and leaving, and Congress returning to session by 7 p.m., able to certify the election. As a result, first, the President of the United States was banned from Twitter, which legitimizes all subsequent bans of anyone on any political ground and certifies the banning of hundreds and hundreds of accounts, including many Iranian accounts, which were banned simply because the content that they published on Twitter and other social media platforms contradicted U.S. foreign policy imperatives. Donald Trump was also banned from Facebook, from Instagram, from virtually every other social media platform in coordinated fashion, creating or confirming the sense among his followers that Trump was the target and victim of a deep state conspiracy, which involved big tech, Congress, and the U.S. intelligence services. Their perception had been confirmed. The ban was cheered on by elements of the left, which fancy themselves as civil libertarians. And now we see left-wing groups and individuals being banned from social media. These are our digital commons. This is where this is our Hyde Park. This is our public space, but it's privatized. And there are government organizations related to the intelligence services, cutouts like the Atlantic Council, to censor social media. This is not understood. So following the banning of Trump, there was the occupation of central D.C., not just the area around the Capitol, but downtown D.C., the entire National Mall, going all the way up to Chinatown, was surrounded by fencing. 28,000 members of the National Guard came into this city, and they had nothing to do. They were responding to non-existent threats, which were propagated by the FBI, not pro-Trump groups, in order to protect Biden from Americans. And this was to protect the inauguration, but they're still here. Biden was inaugurated, and the U.S. troops are still here. There are still 5,000 of them. There are fences surrounding government buildings that are about 12 feet high, covered in barbed wire with troops. Everywhere, there are new laws being discussed and proposed to treat the pro-Trump right-wing masses as a new Al-Qaeda, that we've already seen the FBI manufacture terror plots by inducing mentally vulnerable and extreme right-wingers into agreeing to a controlled terror plot and then being arrested. Then the public is told, well, the governor of Michigan was nearly assassinated, without any mention of the FBI's role. This is precisely what happened to Muslim Americans after 9/11, and it is certainly ironic that the supporters of this Islamophobic campaign that swept the U.S. are now being targeted, but they see themselves as victims of a tyrannical government. A CBS poll taken several days after the January 6th riot found that 54% of Americans now see fellow Americans as the greatest national security threat, as the greatest threat to their security. Only 8% of Americans, according to this poll, see foreign nations or foreign organizations as the greatest threat to their security. A complete reversal and inversion of the post 9/11 mentality. Now the terrorism lives within the United States, and Americans are pitted against Americans. Does this mean that Americans, the majority of Americans, see those who are capable of committing the most violence, who are capable of stealing the most from Americans, who are capable of wreaking the most havoc as their enemies? Unfortunately, I don't think so, although this question has not been put to the American public. It simply means that Americans are afraid of those who are closest to them, their own neighbors or those who may live in the suburbs. However, another event which Alastair referred to shows that there is a deeply embedded class consciousness within sectors of the American public that exists outside of the left-right paradigm. And this refers to the Reddit rebellion, which took place during the past 2 weeks, in which a group of, in many cases, anonymous, low amateur retail investors coordinated together on a website called Reddit, on a chat room known as Wall Street Bets, and provided one another with financial advice in order to do great harm to hedge funders, vulture capitalists who contribute nothing to society, who bet on the failure of companies and who were making billions of dollars in profits as the American public and small businesses were being destroyed during the pandemic. Here in the United States, anyone who is of the millennial generation is familiar with the store GameStop. Might have gone at the shopping mall or down the street to buy video games. And because no one can go to these stores because there's not much of an economy right now and many stores have been closed for months, GameStop was failing. So hedge funders bet on its failure. This is called short selling, but they were actually naked short sales where the hedge funders didn't even have the cash to pay for the stocks they were buying. And so these people on Reddit, amateur investors, people stuck at home who are in their 20s, who don't have loads of money, they realized that if they all got together and bought up as much GameStop stock as possible, the short sellers, the hedge funders, would then have to buy stocks themselves to compensate for their lost positions, and it would send the stocks surging, and the amateur investors would make lots of money while the hedge funders would lose tens of billions of dollars. It was very much an online version of Occupy Wall Street, sticking it to the man, and it worked. Many people talked about on this Reddit group being able to pay for their family's cancer treatment, which we don't get in this country because there's no free health care. Being able to pay off their debt, their college loans. Hedge funders lost in one day on January 27th something close to $70 billion. $20 billion. This was remarkable, just on GameStop. And we cannot underestimate the political and ideological dimension here of people coming together without, in many cases, any similarity politically, racially, culturally, religiously, to rebel against financial elites using the methods available. It's still taking place. This hasn't ended yet. And what this group experienced online was anti-democratic suppression that illustrated for them that the American soul, the shining city on the hill, which had based its democratic myth on the free market, was deeply unfree. First, the trading app that many of these small-time investors relied on, known as Robinhood, blocked their trades, said, you are not allowed to buy any more stock in this company GameStop because, while they didn't say it explicitly, you are hurting the hedge funders, including a hedge fund called Citadel, which essentially owns Robinhood. Suddenly, people were not able to trade and buy stock. They couldn't buy stock on other platforms. And one of the major chat forums where the trades were being coordinated was shut down. Discord shut down on the grounds that these investors were involved in hate speech. So progressive hate speech laws were deployed to prevent people from speaking to each other at this Silicon Valley platform. Then the Biden administration responds without a response. They said, we're monitoring the situation.
And who in the Biden administration got $810,000 of speaking fees from Citadel?
Exactly. And they said, we're monitoring the situation. And fortunately, we have the first female Treasury Secretary. And we can all applaud that this the White House spokesperson said we can all applaud that we have a female Treasury Secretary. So using identity politics to paper over corruption, and the corruption is what you just mentioned, Mohammad. Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, has been giving multi-million-dollar lectures for the financial industry, for the big banks and the hedge funders, and she received $810,000 from Citadel, which is the partial owner of Robinhood. I mean, I can get more into it. And Citadel lost billions of dollars as a result of these coordinated buys, as a result of the Reddit rebellion. So it has exposed corruption within the political class, bipartisan corruption, for everyone to see. And it's forged new alliances that we really hadn't seen before across partisan lines, where members of Congress, Democrat and Republican, who want to cater to a very angry American public and constituency, are demanding that Robinhood and these other trading platforms allow people to buy stock. But this is really about restoring the myth of the free market. You're allowed to participate in the free market. And ultimately, the punishment and the penalties will disproportionately affect the common investor and not the billionaire class that has been running these same kind of short plays on Wall Street, which are technically, naked shorts are technically illegal. And our government has almost never stepped in to stop it. So this event has raised class consciousness. But what I mentioned about January 6th also applies to the kind of censorship and suppression that the Reddit investors have experienced, because it also reminds me of what we see the United States do on the world stage, which is to prevent nations that it targets from trading with one another and even engaging in the world financial system, Iran being target number one. Well, we've seen Iran and Venezuela, two targeted nations which are subjected to medieval financial sieges by the United States, manipulating the world financial market through its Treasury Department, have had attempted to have bilateral trade relations, which should simply be legal in the world. And this is something we're supposed to believe in the United States as well, free trade. But it's only free trade for us. So when Iran charters ships to send fuel to Venezuela, if those ships are not owned by Iran, and in some cases, even if they are, the U.S. Navy or the U.S. vassal states will come and seize those ships. And the United States government will even boast that it has seized and taken Iranian fuel, which was intended for Venezuela, which sits on the largest oil reserves in the world, now needs because it is unable to produce fuel domestically because of the blockade. It can't mix its heavy crude with lighter forms of crude oil in order to have fuel to power cars. When I was last there were long lines at gas stations to get gasoline. This is a result of a siege, and it's motivated by the same mentality that shut down these trades, which were upsetting the financial elite. So it's important to highlight these consciousness-raising or mask-lifting moments that the American public reflexively understands to help them better understand how U.S. empire functions on the world stage. And then they can understand better how average Iranians and Venezuelans feel. Of course, the number one target here going forward is not a mid-level power like Iran or Venezuela, but China, and I'm sure Pepe will touch on this. And I just wanted to mention one more event, if you can call it that, very briefly. The Atlantic Council, which is the unofficial think tank of NATO in Washington, funded by corporate America, Wall Street, the arms industry, the U.S. government, the Gulf states, and the British government and NATO, released a paper that everyone's talking about in Washington. It was released anonymously, which is extremely unusual, and it is called the Longer Telegram, referring to Truman's national security advisor's long telegram, George Kennan's long telegram, calling for the containment of the Soviet Union and outlining a prescription for waging a Cold War. This outlines a prescription for waging a new Cold War on China. And many of the prescriptions that are provided seem to be a warmed over version of the kind of diplomacy and belligerent measures that were conceived after the Vietnam War era by Henry Kissinger, who happens to be the longest serving member of the Atlantic Council's board. And I'll just read one passage very quickly, which I think will wrap up wrap up the month pretty well. This anonymous author warned that an authoritarian state, referring to China, in a position of global leadership will not only lead to the demise of the current order, but will, in the process, curtail U.S. interests as well. Ultimately, it would degrade the American soul, including the innate understanding of who Americans are as a people and what the nation stands for in the world. To abandon this mission would mean the city upon a hill would fade from view as the United States became just another nation state in narrow pursuit of its own national self-interest. That is a fancy way of saying that the U.S. will cease to be a global hegemon if China or other powers rise to the surface and we suddenly find ourselves in a multipolar world. And the only way to head off that reality, which I believe is inevitable, and to maintain control of the world financial system in order to guarantee the U.S., what's left of the U.S. middle class, the so-called American way of life, which is really code for endless financial accumulation of American elites, is through hard power. This paper was published as the USS Theodore Roosevelt, an aircraft carrier, was sailing provocatively through the South China Sea to protect shipping lanes, which are intended to guarantee that American way of life. Hard power. And the hard power that we've seen the U.S. administer around the world through military interventions and shows of force creates states of exception around the world where the U.S. behaves in a way that has discredited it, caused enmity, hatred among other nations, and brought back the violence to our own society that we witnessed on January 6th, where a disproportionate number of those rioters were bringing their military background back into the picture, carrying out in their minds an operation ordered by their literal commander-in-chief, Donald Trump. So the contradictions are inherent in this recipe for a new Cold War with China. The contradictions will be heightened if the Biden administration or subsequent administration follows these recommendations and goes vaulting forward into a new Cold War, and it will accelerate the imperial decline that we've just witnessed this month.
Well, I mean, with the Federal Reserve injecting, I think, $20 trillion, I'm not quite sure they really need China to bring down the United States. They're pretty well equipped to do it on their own. I was saying Bolivia, but Max heard Libya, and I was thinking that
Libya.
the same thing. It doesn't really matter, and that
Yeah.
sort of is pushing me towards Pepe, because although I don't want to push you in any direction, but you could add to what Alastair and Max said about the situation in the United States. But what about China? What about Libya, Bolivia, Iran, the rest of the world? I mean, it is a bit disappointing as an Iranian that I've been relegated into that 8% threat to the United States, and I'm probably a fraction of that. And now it's 54% from inside the United States. So it's sort of disappointing. We used to be way up there, but we're sort of like in the second, third league now. We have a lot of work to do. But and it is ironic, because this is Max alluded to this, because after 9/11, those who the most Islamophobic are right now the ones who are being targeted the most by the political establishment in the United States. Quite ironic. But in any case, Pepe, I'll just pass it on to you.
I'll be brief after these two wonderful presentations, the macro picture and the situation internally in the United States around the blue zone in Washington, which now Max could get firsthand the feeling of being right in front of the green zone in Baghdad. Not too many different, less tanks, I would say. I was
the same amount of fast food restaurants.
Yeah. The thing is, Max, around the red zone, there were a lot of kebab sellers. That's the major difference. And of course, a lot of tanks. So when I was in Baghdad, in fact, during and after I came back and during the petrol surge and all that, I never entered the green zone, in fact, because you had 5 layers of security to get there. And it was absolutely impossible, even for a journalist, in fact, unless you could get those American clearances. So I always had my interviews in the red zone outside. So I will have, for instance, parliamentarians crossing the green zone inside. It took them 15 minutes, and then we could talk outside in the red zone in real life. Anyway, now you know how it works in DC, which is something that 15 years ago, for instance, none of us could ever imagine that you would have the green zone replicated in the heart of the empire, which is exactly what happened only a few days ago. But look, I'll be brief because I would like to have more time for all of us to engage in a conversation. I would like to introduce a sort of a Dead Kennedy's holidays in Cambodia approach to the whole thing, a little more anarchic, if you allow me. So whatever we think about Trump, there's one big merit of the whole Trump phenomenon. He accelerated the striptease of the imperial king, in fact. The king now not only is totally naked, but his masks have fallen as well. And this is something that the global South as a whole, apart, of course, from those, from the Saudi elite, from the les amis de Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed, a few misguided upper-class Colombians and Brazilians, for instance, the whole global South see it for what it is. The king is naked, but who is going to substitute the king? What's coming after the king is naked? So I think we had an inkling, and it was very clear, and it was so sharp that you could not see one single article in the Washington Post and the New York Times analyzing it. Was both speeches this week at Davos, first by Xi Jinping on Monday, and then by Putin on Wednesday. They are complementary, both speeches. Xi was basically talking about what comes next, inevitably, as seen by the Politburo, as seen by Xi, by Politburo, by the Chinese leadership, and by the Chinese ruling class as a whole. A multipolar world where China is going to have, if not the preeminent role, at least one of the preeminent roles in terms of being the number one trading power in the world, already the number one economic power in the world in PPP terms, and soon, geopolitically, and I would say before 2030 and probably by 2025, the number one political power in the world, geopolitical power in the world. And then Putin, in an extremely sophisticated speech, which very few people understood the layers of Putin's speech. The best analysis that I read, that I could find, it had to be by a Russian, Rostislav Ishchenko, which I had the pleasure to meet in Moscow in 2018. He's an old school analyst. He writes only in Russian, but you can read it in English translated by the Grayzone website, which is a pretty good website translating some of the best Russian thinkers into English. And Ishchenko, he talked about the absolutely spot-on reference to the 1930s, and Putin made an explicit reference that we are probably being hurled into a 1930s style situation at the moment. But also the fact that this speech came suddenly, without warning, practically out of the blue. And then Ishchenko mentions the previous speeches, the 2007 speech in the Munich Security Conference, where nobody was expecting that a still ailing Russia, after those Yeltsin years, could come on basically on a NATO Atlantic Council top of Atlanticist Valhalla platform, like the Munich Security Conference. And Putin was saying, look, we believe in multilateralism. I think this unilateral arrangement in the world is fated to it's fated to fail, essentially. And since this day, in 2007, Putin became officially the West's number one enemy. So this has been going on for 14 years now, almost. And then 2008 in Georgia, where nobody was expecting that Saakashvili scam would be responded by Russia so swiftly. Then the reaction to Maidan and what happened in Crimea, which was decision taken in Russia in less than 48 hours, because they knew exactly what would happen after Maidan. The real target was not Kiev. The real target was Sebastopol. And Russian intelligence knew that they were going to Sebastopol, and the Russians had to be there before.
Yeah.
And that Alastair knows the story very well, I'm sure. And that's why the reunification of Crimea was so swift, with no violence and no blood whatsoever, especially because the absolute majority of the Crimeans wanted it, as was ratified by the plebiscite later on. And now this speech coming on the same week of the Great Reset apotheosis. I call it the aperitivo, as we call it in Italy. In fact, the big Great Reset meeting is going to be in the spring in Singapore. But the virtual Davos this year was the aperitivo for the Great Reset. All the major round tables, the overarching theme was the Great Reset. And when you look at what Xi said and what Putin said, it's the anti-Great Reset. Because the way they see multilateralism, the end of the unipolar moment, and the fact that they are elaborating very diplomatically about the king is naked, is the absolute opposite of the Great Reset, which is basically let's let the system crash and then build back better, as Max referred to, our way, which is our own exclusionary way, which is, in fact, class struggle on an astronomical level, in fact. We, the 0.001%, we're going to crash the old system. We're going to impose the new rules. Everybody has to obey, otherwise we're going to crush you. So this is the great reset in 10 seconds, essentially. And Putin and Xi are saying, no, our program for the world in terms of a multipolar world, different centers of decision and complementary centers of decision and a global discussion at the top, it's completely different. And Putin was reiterating that with the very, very important points about the king is naked. And he was delivering a direct message to the crash test dummy hologram administration that, look, whatever you do, our program is different and we're not going to be swayed. So this was very, very important. And when you look at these two speeches, and then you look, for instance, at Michael Hudson's new book. He already published the first chapter of his new book, which is a very sophisticated, direct study comparing financialization, the American system, with productive capitalism as is practiced in China. So this is a sort of a roadmap for the whole global south of, so what are you going to choose? Are you going to follow the king is naked system, which GameStop this week once again proved that the whole system is rigged, as Max explained it very well? Or are you going to pay close attention to what the Chinese are doing in terms of how to finance and how to distribute and how to have sustainable development based on productive industrial capitalism, which is something that completely disappeared from the United States. So then we can, if we look at these three texts together, I think we have more or less a roadmap of there is no alternative. Now, it's the anti-TINA. And it's already there, and it has been spelled out these past few days. So, so my intention here was to throw this theme for my great friends ahead for our conversation, all right?
Okay, well, before I go to the second round, Dr. Zainab Qasimi, she's the head of the Institute, and she said she's going to shut me down after an hour and 45 minutes. So she's God. The Syrian Iranian boss that I have to listen to. So
we have half an hour for our discussion.
I'll cheat. I won't let her. I'll keep going until she actually shut me down. But there are a couple of things I wanted to swiftly say, and then move on to Alastair, and then we'll go for a second round and maybe hopefully a third round. And that is that what Pepe has been saying, I think, is key in our part of the world as well, because the Americans seem to think that this is the new Cold War, as Max has pointed out, but this is not the old United States. The world has changed. The United States has changed. U.S. soft power has been effectively demolished by the scenes in the United States. The identity that the United States has projected of itself is fragmented. Who speaks for the United States? What does it mean to be American? That's a great question now. The racial divide, the class divide, the identity issues that are now being debated, but not in a friendly way in the United States nowadays, raises serious questions. And then there's the issue of liberalism, because until recently, liberals have always said that they were non-ideological and that they were the most tolerant, but they've shown themselves by shutting down both the right and now the left as well. They've shown their strong authoritarian streak and intolerance. So that is also an issue, that they can no longer speak in the language that they used before. Shutting down even a sitting president. I mean, that's not something that we see often in the rest of of the world, whether you like Trump or not. And then there's the issue of, the economic crisis, the widening gap between rich and poor, and the troubles that lie ahead for the United States. I think this depression that has coincided with COVID-19, and I think COVID-19, as you all know better than I, contributed to it. It wasn't the reason. I mean, Trump himself was not he did not create the problems. He was what the problems in the United States created. He was a creation of those problems. Those problems led to his election, and he only intensified them. But so on the one hand, the U.S. economy is collapsing. I mean, maybe that's a harsh word to use. Alastair could correct me if I'm wrong. U.S. soft power has collapsed. The only thing the United States has is hard power, but hard power is very expensive. And as we've seen in our part of the world, what has happened is that the United States has spent perhaps $10 trillion in our region. And it is the longer that it occupies these countries, the more it's going to be expensive. And for Iran, for example, this is Iran's home turf. It's not very difficult for the Iranians and its allies across the region to keep the Americans bleeding. Not literally, they don't need to spill American blood. All they have to do is bankrupt the United States and to make them continue spending. And really, ultimately, the United States will find itself in a position where the occupation in this region is not sustainable. And that's one other thing that I think American elites don't understand, and that is that while they're trying to pressure Iran to bow down to American demands, they don't recognize that, A, Iran has resisted Trump. What can Biden do that Trump hasn't already done? And B, the United States has been severely weakened. The events in the last few days on Wall Street, the events in Washington on January the 6th, and all these other, the sheer number of people who are dying in the United States because of COVID, and all the underlying problems make this a very different United States. And the Iranians and their allies recognize this. They recognize that that time is on their side, and that they are empowered in this new order. So it's, on the one hand, you have China, you have Russia, you have Iran and its allies in particular, which makes it much more than just a country. It goes from the Hindu Kush to Central Asia to the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. So what is the United States going to do, Alastair? Well, I mean, with all these adversaries at home and abroad, what's the plan?
I thought, Pepe, what you said was really very striking and very important and very interesting, because also I had looked at President Putin's speech, and both his, in the context of the telephone call earlier between Biden and Putin, where we had very different readouts from the White House and from the Russian side and that. And paradoxically, I thought what we're seeing actually is a complete change in President Putin. The West has always presented Putin in the past as being a sort of hard-nosed, hardliner autocrat, when in fact he was anything but. He was actually something quite different. He was actually both pragmatic, and he was flexible, and he was really culturally disposed towards Europe. Mm-hmm. Now, I think we see actually that he is becoming hardline. And again, that was reflected in a very hardline speech. I mean, you mentioned the Munich speech, but this was on a par with that. But hardline not about the internal politics of Russia, but hardline against Europe and all these nonsenses with Navalny, with Putin's palace and all of this. And I think he's changed. And paradoxically, it switched round. I mean, when he was thought to be hardline and an autocrat, he was never that. Now, I think in respect of Britain, he's going to tolerate, in respect of Europe and in respect of Germany, he's going to tolerate no more nonsense from the EU. Where is all of this going to take us? Well, I think what you're saying is right, but I think there are two things. I mean, Mohammad rightly brought up the question. I mean, we've got the Great Reset, but what about the unmasking of the United States? I mean, I think that is so important, not just for the global south, but everywhere, for two reasons. It allows people to reinvent themselves for the first time since the Second World War. What do I mean by that is, the instrument of sort of social cohesion that we've had to live on during this period has been the myth of liberal democracy. Everywhere we're told we must have liberal democracy, that is a sort of cohesion, the cohesive element to keeping society intact. We've now seen that I mean, we all knew, but it's now been obvious that actually the whole thing was rigged. Whatever was, the ballots, the whole process has been completely exposed. The mail-in ballots, it was a rigged. I mean, whether it was fraudulently taken or not doesn't matter. It was a rigged election. We all see that. The next election, if it ever takes place, will be even more rigged. And I think what that does is actually move the rest of the world in response to what's happened in America and to the 6th of January to looking, how do they recover their own myth? If democracy, liberal democracy and liberalism are the gods that have failed, where do they find their own myth for the future? And this is not just the reset question, economic one. This is a political, cultural answer. And I think we're going to see states going back very much. I mean, like Iran did in the revolution, go back to its archetypal narrative of Kabbalah, of the Mahdi and others, to create a myth that provided cohesion to their societies. You, Pepe, have written a remarkable article about Mao Zedong meeting Confucius. And I think in many respects, China can move along that path in a way which is very striking with because Confucianism is not at odds with the modern world. I mean, I would say more Taoism is not at odds with the modern world, certainly. Confucianism is maybe a little bit different. And Russia, too. Again, the extraordinary thing that we saw a couple of months ago with the unveiling of their new cathedral just outside Moscow, 80 kilometers outside Moscow. An extraordinary piece of architecture which combined modernity with the tradition of Russia. What European state would begin to have the energy, cultural energy, to do what Russia did in that and produce? I mean, France is still quibbling and arguing like the Europeans would about what to do about Notre Dame. Is it going to be a fiberglass roof or is it going to be a stone roof? No one can, so nothing happens. I mean, there is cultural energy in these states, in Iran, in China, and in Russia. It may have been suppressed, it may not be in full blossom at all, but I think this is one of the ways in which we're going to see the world going. More cultural states rather than nation states. Cultural civilizations re-emerging, and people will have to reinvent their own, if you like, moral narrative, just as Iran did in the revolution with the Kabbalah and the story as an explanation of where they are and as an example of where we go for the future. I think for Europe it's going to be much, much harder because even more so than America, Europe has lost touch, lost connection with its own cultural roots. European civilization is completely empty and hollow. And I think the most striking example of that was when Macron tried to sort of get us back to some sort of European civilization. He could only point to the Enlightenment, which was the counter-revolution, if you like, rather than actually the essence of European culture. So I think this is going to be an important element. As to your questions about where next with America in this role, I do think that there is one cultural thing that is really so difficult. There are really only two parts of the world, three, that have this culture of the elect, the chosen people. Calvinism of Europe is one of them. We know that America came to America and was, if you like, the sort of motor of American political power for many years, the sense of it. It now is called exceptionalism, but it's still the point. The question is, can those societies that are based on the elect, on being the elect, and therefore better and technologically better, can they cope with a new paradigm of civilizational states emerging that are not their states? I mean, this is the old question of, can the United States allow another state? Because whenever we talk about China, and Max talked about that, which I've read, that piece about the longer narrative, that longer letter. It's all about the civilizational threat now. Mm-hmm. You see it more than the military one. They're going to destroy our liberties, the way our life is, our way of being. I think this is going to be a really difficult problem about the question of whether the states that see themselves as the elect, as the chosen people, as the masters of the universe. And that's, of course, what Davos is. These big tech people see themselves as the masters of the universe, and the rest of us as mere nobodies that they have to run. But it isn't going to work. And the reason, anyway, I mean, it's a fantasy world that they're constructing because of events and because of the pandemic. And, I wrote a little while ago that if you look at all of the story about how, there's going to be a supply side revival and a miracle because we're all going to be automated and AI is going to change our lives. Look back over this period since the war. All the times we've had the big technical advances in computers and computer sciences, actually productivity per head in the United States and Europe was declining. I think actually that if you look at the productivity figures about productivity to head, they're much more closely related actually to energy finds. The big discoveries of oil that sort of finished in the 70s. The later, what happened to Great Britain with the North Sea oil and things. I think these were far more important than the actual technology in this. But if we see what is happening in Europe, the protests that have been in Holland, the protests in France, the protests in Italy, which are hardly being reported, people are not going to accept their livelihoods being just destroyed. You can go to cities here, when we go down to Rome, where my children are at school, it's dead. The shops are finished. I mean, it's not going to be there's a switch, as Wall Street keeps saying, the great push up. It's all going to come back. We just have to turn on the money supply and all will be right. There'll be the great rebound back to what it was in the past. These enterprises are liquidated. They have to be started again. It's not a question of just, give them another $1,000 and something. Everything blossoms in the garden again. And the idea, as they summed it up at Davos this time, saying so starkly, you will have nothing, you will own nothing, and you will be happy. This is just, one of these fantasies of the elect that they can take this forward. So I think, yes, we will look at what comes out. I really think that paradoxically, because everyone said it couldn't, Pepe, think that actually China is capable of managing a quite, statist economy with modern innovation, which I don't think America can manage. But paradoxically, China is probably going to crack that one, that it's going to be both innovative as well as a command economy. I think Russia is going to reinvent itself. It's taken itself right out of the economy. It is the only economy that is classic economy in that way. And I think Iran is going to get through this period as well. And that's going to transform the Middle East in the next period. So I think we're going to see a really difficult period now. But I don't think actually, I think one of the things that's so clear when you look at all of the things that Sullivan and Blinken have said, all the states just dismiss it. When he says, we're going to challenge China and this, Biden is so hard-nosed about Russia. Well, he'll find actually that Putin's pretty hard-nosed back, and so is Xi. And so is Iran. And, and even the Europeans, God bless them, have started to talk about strategic autonomy. Well, that's strategic autonomy from America, not from other places. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to be a turbulent place, but the chances of the Great Reset, I think, are very remote. Sorry. Mohammad.
No. That was excellent. Alastair alluded to Walter Russell Mead both directly and indirectly. He and I had a very long exchange at one of Alastair's conferences in Beirut, and I would like to know what he has to say about the situation right now, although I'm sure he still would disagree with me.
He would.
I don't think
even more colorful.
Yes, I don't think he'd be willing to speak with me after what happened then. But Max, what Alastair is saying is much more than just a Suez moment. It's for the British and after the Second World War and their decline in Suez, they tried to reestablish themselves and show that they were the power. They were still the British Empire, and Suez revealed that they weren't. But what Max is saying is, I think, what Alastair is saying is much more than just that. And I was wondering, does what we're talking about right now, the four of us, does it make any sense in Washington? Because I think that Washington is still living in this bubble, and they continue to see the world as it was. Washington, for the most part. But for us looking at Washington from the outside, it seems pretty catastrophic. And perception is extremely important, whether you're looking at it from the inside or the outside. So A, where do you think things are going? And B, how do you sort of bring these two very differing views together? The way in which we, at least rightly or wrongly, perceive what's going on in the United States, and the self-perception, at least among certain elites. And I was wondering, what do you think, outside of the elites, among progressives, among Trump supporters, the thing that I was alluding to at the beginning, how is that going to play out? Because I think on the one hand you have red and blue, but you also have fragmentation in both, and you also have the class struggle. And the many Trump supporters are impoverished now. They were the middle class that has been demolished. And many on the progressive side, they were always impoverished, and some of them are from the middle class who have also been impoverished. And is there any means for reconciliation? I'm sure there are means, but is there really any hope for some sort of reconciliation among them? Or do you think this is going to end with great division and things will get more fragmented and perhaps more dangerous?
A lot of questions that could lead me into speaking for another hour.
Will they cut off?
We're authoritarians.
Until they cut us off. Yeah.
Yes, we're authoritarians, and you should take us very seriously.
Yeah,
And we're not giving up on the nuclear program either.
You can enact some authoritarian speech measures here. Yeah, much I love the sound of my voice. It could get dangerous, but since you brought up Suez, it just reminded me that there has not been an American president like Eisenhower to take on a Ben Gurion or a Netanyahu and cut them down to size since then. And that illustrates something about the delusions and corruption of Washington, the bubble that we live in. There's a misplaced optimism in Washington within the foreign policy elite and the political establishment about what a Biden era means and what the vanquishing of Trump and his hopeful impeachment. There'll be kind of a show trial soon in Washington because they can't get over Trump. They can't get enough of him. He needs to have one last act. What that means. And I think since Alastair and Pepe brought up Russia, which is seen as one of the two quote unquote revisionists that the U.S. is now great power competition with, actually a new Cold War, according to the Trump national security doctrine unveiled in 2018, which remains, I think, the national security consensus for the U.S. It's important to understand how Russia's understood in Washington versus the reality. And it's understood in a very ahistorical way, where if you don't accept the view that Putin is this dangerous figure who intends to restore the Soviet Union because of his background in the KGB by dominating neighboring states and interfering in their affairs and interfering in the U.S.'s affairs and poisoning his enemies and murdering journalists. If you don't accept that view, then you will be marginalized in Washington and demonized as someone who was, until his recent death, our only truly qualified, eminent Russia scholar Stephen F. Cohen was. He was abused for the last 4 or 5 years of his life for refusing to accept that view and taking a historical view, understanding how Putin became the figure he is, how he arrived at what we would call a more hardline position, and ignoring the history of Russia in the 90s, where in 1993, U.S. pundits, the same figures who were ginning up Russiagate, were cheering on Boris Yeltsin as he bombed the Russian parliament, attacked it with tanks in order to get out the hardliners, the communists. It was said that, these anti-democratic measures were needed to restore quote-unquote democracy, which really meant the imposition of neoliberal privatization measures that saw the deaths by, excess deaths of 3 to 5 million Russians. The U.S. has never wanted a Russian Democrat who maintained strong popular support from the Russian public. What it wanted was a Pinochet-like figure who would administer this economic agenda at the barrel of a gun and hopefully not with too much time keeled over on a table with a bottle of empty vodka by his side, which was the folly of Yeltsin and led to the rise of Putin, who had been initially blessed by the Wall Street Journal op-ed page. Bill Browder, one of his greatest enemies, praised him. Boris Berezovsky, the pro-Yeltsin oligarch who funded Ukraine's Orange Revolution, was initially welcoming Putin. And it really took those 7 or 8 years between Putin's entrance into the Kremlin and the Munich Security Conference, which Pepe brought up, for it to dawn on the United States that Putin was not going to be the Pinochet that it wanted, although he was not exactly a socialist. John McCain was seated in the first row as Putin delivered his speech in Munich. McCain, who'd never met a war he didn't like. McCain, who really represents the delusions that prevail in Washington, who was a key steward of the neoconservative movement. And he was furious as Putin spoke. And Putin said, we have tried to work with you. We've tried to cooperate. You did the Iraq war. Now you're bringing NATO back to our doorstep, and we cannot stand for it any longer. And McCain's expression betrayed ahistoricity, the failure to understand how Putin arrived at this point. And I think it led the United States to initiate one of the most important moments in 21st century Europe that will define the course of Europe, which I think, as both of you mentioned, was the Maidan coup in 2014, when the U.S. instrumentalized nationalist and nationalist elements to oust a government that was seen as insufficiently pro-European, too pro-Russian. Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State, was handing out cookies in Maidan Square. Victoria Nuland is returning to the State Department. She's returning to the Biden administration after this catastrophe, which defined Russia's relationship to Europe going forward as excluded from the family of Europe, and consolidated the conflict between the West and Europe, and of course used Ukraine as basically a bunch of expendable bullet stoppers who are in a terrible situation now as a result. Now, if you look at Putin and Russia and the situation and its view of the United States, it could care less what Washington thinks. I think they've gotten to the point where they've decided that there can no longer be, except in extraordinary situations, cooperation with Washington is going to be impossible, especially after the last 4 years of Russiagate, where diplomacy was effectively criminalized. And the protests that are taking place today and for the last several days, and the whole over the jailing of Alexei Navalny, who has suddenly become the West's favorite dissident in the world, and who was not a necessarily popular politician. It was timed. The protests began the day after Biden's entrance into office. The Navalny saga began towards the end of the campaign with this mysterious poisoning incident, him being taken to Germany and becoming really the West's man, although he always had been in many ways. I mean, he was part of this Yale Fellows program where people involved in Maidan or Venezuela were also trained. But this represents an effort by elements in the military intelligence apparatus in the U.S. to establish a continuum of anti-Russia hostility between the Trump and Biden eras and analyze any instinct Biden might have for cooperating with Russia. And I think that's well understood in Moscow. So Moscow is now able to turn east towards China in a way that they have not before and build this relationship which the U.S. had always sought to divide through the Kissingerian triangulation model of negotiating with one side or the other to exploit rivalry between the Soviet Union and China. And in this Atlantic Council paper, which I referenced before, which really read like warmed over Kissinger, the author said that the greatest mistake the United States had made in the last 10 years was allowing Russia and China to embrace one another in an alliance that will continue to flourish. And that same, what the U.S. would regard as a hardline position, has taken hold in Beijing through Xi, who now understands that the U.S. is intent on a new Cold War and not cooperation or allowing history to take its natural course. And even in smaller states like Syria, where you have a leader, Bashar al-Assad, who is courted by John Kerry, who is visited by Nancy Pelosi in Damascus, who is seen as a figure who would be a quote-unquote reformist, who would open up the economy and slowly move into the realm of the U.S. and negotiate away the Golan Heights. And that's all over. That's completely gone, thanks to the folly of the U.S. and the perspective, the delusional perspective that dominates Washington, which is that all of these figures and obstacles can simply be removed by hard power or through hybrid warfare. And that same view, unfortunately, prevails within the Biden administration, I think, towards Iran. That Iran is willing to accept another deal, another JCPOA, without sanctions relief. The Biden team, at least of Blinken and Sullivan, the principals, they see the sanctions that Trump imposed illegally, restoring the old sanctions that were illegal under the JCPOA and the new sanctions as leverage. And they think that Iran is so weak that it will accept an even worse deal than the very intrusive and onerous one that it already accepted. That is another delusion. And what they fail to take account of is that Iran has actually strengthened itself in many ways during the Trump era, even as its economy has suffered. It has new weapons. It has new resolve. And as we see in Iran refusing vaccines from its two countries which have sought to essentially destroy it, the U.S. and UK, it has a fairly strong biomedical sector, as another country under U.S. embargo does, Cuba, and is willing to assert its national sovereignty at a time of great trial during the pandemic. And so I think the delusion in Washington is that we can go back to the way things were in the 1990s when the U.S. was at the height of its unipolar power. The reality is that as our cultural divisions grow in the U.S., as social conflict rises to levels that haven't been seen since perhaps the 1960s, and maybe exceeds those, and as the leadership fails to provide an answer, it will take a will take a cultural turn that will resemble Israel. Israel's a country I've covered extensively. I've spent a lot of time there. I spent basically 5 years writing my second book about Israel. And Israel's a country where the Jewish public is actually more divided than outsiders can imagine. You have all these different groups that have come from around the world simply because they have Jewish heritage, and they're put in a place they don't understand, where they often don't know the language, and they're expected to all fight together for their survival. And so anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, and anti-Muslim racism is deployed to unite the public against an external threat in order to consolidate internal cohesion. And that is what the United States is doing with the China threat. It was on display at the U.S. Capitol, where I witnessed right-wing Trump supporters scream at cops, police officers in riot gear, that they were agents of the Chinese Communist Party, that they were communists. This was omnipresent that day, that everybody was controlled by China, who was stopping them from overrunning the Capitol. And among progressives, anti-China hysteria is marketed in terms of human rights propaganda and is having a great effect. It's forcing the progressives and the institutional foundation-funded left to return to their American exceptionalist roots and remember that in the end, whether they don't like the system or they don't like the police very much, they don't like these corporate Democrats, in the end, they're going to have to stand and fight for the liberal international order against China. And so the politically mobilized sectors of the American public are going to be united together against a China threat, which will continue to grow and produce more and more profits for the military-industrial complex. Let's remember that Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, 50% of it or so was about China, not just the threat of Islam. And that is a terrible tragedy moving forward. But as Alastair said, for the rest of the world, while they might pass through a difficult period, they will come out on the other side with greater sovereignty. And I think we're simply moving on an inevitable course towards multipolarity.
Well, okay. Well, that's we need a lot more time, obviously, but we've out of time. And
I promise my next response will be much shorter.
Are you getting the silver bullet now?
No. Pepe, if you could give your response as well, but we've run out of time. But Pepe will give his response, and then we'll wrap it up where each of you give a couple of minutes of your final comments on the topic. I just wanted to add what Max was saying. The situation, the comparison is very similar to Iran, because as the United States is now demanding Iran renegotiate the deal, the Iranians are saying, the first deal, many in Iran don't believe it was a good deal at all. I mean, that's another story. There are divides in Iran. I have my own personal opinion, but I don't want to go there now. But the point is that the Iranians negotiated.
Mohammad, in 1 minute. Your opinion in 1 minute.
I think the deal is flawed. I think there's positive elements within it and strikingly negative elements as well. But it's something that Iran agreed to. But the Americans never implemented it, whether under Obama or under Trump, of course, and Biden is not going to do it either. And when the United States expects Iran to renegotiate, Iran is not going to do that. Mm-hmm. But the real issue is when we've already negotiated something and the other side is not abiding by its commitments, what is there to negotiate? Because in future they're not going to abide by commitments either. So Iran is, Trump wasn't able to force Iran into appeasement, and Biden doesn't have that capability. The same is true with Iran's missile defense capabilities. It's surrounded by American bases, or as the United States and Erdogan and the Israelis and the Saudis and others that were supporting Al-Qaeda and ISIS in this region. And we know from WikiLeaks how Jake Sullivan said on February the 12th, 2012 to Clinton that Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. The Iranians cannot give up their regional alliances because they know that these countries that supported or who worked with Al-Qaeda, and of course ISIS by extension, because ISIS came out of Al-Qaeda, that it's Iran's allies that prevent ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda from reemerging. So the Americans are making demands that are simply impossible for Iran to meet, and by doing that, the Americans are pushing Russia closer to China, as rightly pointed out before, China closer to Russia, but also Russia and China and Iran closer to each other. They're pushing this. Just like in our region, they keep saying, Iran's influence. They basically created the environment for Iran's influence to increase. They invaded Afghanistan, then they invaded Iraq, then they helped the Saudis invade Yemen. Then they initiated a dirty war in Yemen, and all these peoples and groups and organizations in these different countries turned to Iran for support. So Iran's extended influence in the region is because of the United States more than anything else. So the Americans really don't have much to complain about. But Pepe, sort of put, after hearing what Alastair and Max said and the comments I made, what do you think?
Well, I'll be brief again, because then we have the wrap up, right? Well, to quote Bob Dylan, everything is broken when we think about the U.S., in fact. Internally, as Alastair and Max explained in detail, for the Global South as a whole, the myth of the American dream, it's like we have finally what Hunter Thompson was saying at the time of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. We went in search of the American dream. It was a lame fuck around. Now it's much, much worse, because now we are actually looking at the whole thing dissolving, in fact. And most of the Global South is looking at it's watching it in real time. And of course, they are the best and the brightest all across the global, all along the watchtowers of the Global South. Act. Okay, what's next? I think it's now it's the conclusion of an 80-year process. The book by Stephen Wertheim, Tomorrow the World, it's fascinating. I wrote a mini review, in fact, because I focused basically on the year 1940. The book tracks 1940 to 1945. It's a wonderfully researched book with a very interesting thesis. The beginning of the actual beginning of the empire, as written by the planners and the masters, was not Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941. Was the fall of France in May 1940. And I love this thesis because it makes perfect sense. And he showed how those committees set up by the Council of Foreign Relations, paid by the Rockefeller Foundation, this was discussed and elaborated at the end of 1939. But the committees started to work really, really hard after the fall of France. So this means May, June, July, August 1940. There were 4 committees, and the most important were the Political Committee and the Economic Financial Committee. This is where they started, in a matter of a few months, to draw on paper the extent of the American empire. It started with the Western Hemisphere. No, it's not big enough. Only the Americas. No, we need more. Then the Pacific Basin, and then trying to unite the Western Hemisphere with the Pacific Basin. And then everything except what the Nazis would be able to conquer and maintain in Europe. And then, after Pearl Harbor, in fact, the whole world, actually. So the actual contours of the empire, the big planning, took place in a matter of 12 months only. And this is the world that we have been living in for the past 80 years. And now we can see that the whole scheme, including the Max mentioned the Atlantic Council paper. I read it yesterday, and I plan to write about it tomorrow, in fact. They are absolutely desperate to produce an innocuous paper like this, because they can see how the whole 80-year-long system now is dissolving completely, in political terms, in economic terms, in rigged financial terms, in terms of spheres and influence, and in terms of selling myths, superimposed myths, financial, political, military, and cultural as well, to the rest of the world. And what's left? Cheap demonization of Russia, China, Iran, especially. And something that we never had time to discuss here, but this will be probably the subject of another round table. The importance of the new Silk Roads. What do the new Silk Roads mean in big picture terms? What are the Chinese offering in terms of an inclusive trade development, sustainable development deal for a great deal of the global south? In fact, 130 countries plus are already have already joined the new Silk Roads at different levels, and a lot of international organizations as well. So what's left for the I would say, very mediocre second rank and third rank imperial functionaries like Blinken, Sullivan, Nuland, and all these gangs? These are mediocre imperial functionaries. I wish they were as bold as Captain Willard in Apocalypse Now, intellectual killers. These are the real imperial guys. The really badasses are Captain Willards. They are not Tony Blinkens or Victoria Nulands. So this is what they got left. Can you imagine Tony Blinken devising a global foreign policy for the United States? It has to be extremely mediocre, because we're talking about a guy who was always second rank behind the man who's now president of the United States. So it is we should analyze one day the mediocrity level of the Beltway, in fact, and how these mediocre imperial functionaries, because they control the narrative, they control the language, especially, and they control soft power, they can sell this all over the world, and then you have it on front pages of all the Western papers, or a paper in Nigeria, or a paper in Somaliland, you know. Okay, so there's no conclusion. I prefer to leave it to the three of you, your last thought. My last thought is, in fact, finally we are living what Hunter Thompson said in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Okay. So, Alastair, what do you have to say to that?
I tend to agree with Pepe on all of these things, I have to say. But I would just add one slight thing, that we've been talking about the narrow bubble of Washington and the groupthink and frozen time, that they believe they can just go back to a frozen time pre-Obama and everything can be. I mean, they're sort of obsessed with sort of removing Trump from history altogether, even though Trump has changed the world in many ways, good or bad, but it's changed. I think that really we ought to understand the other thing is that there are very clear symptoms of deep nervousness and lack of confidence within that Washington elite. They may try to sound like they've just sort of teleported back to the Obama period. But when you read things like I wrote a piece this week about, it was based on a New York Times article. And the New York Times article, the op-ed person was saying, you know, yeah, we won, but just by the skin of our teeth. And the anti-democratic Republicans are going to come back, and they're still there, and we have to work out how to move towards a unipolar party system as quickly as we can, effectively, was the proposal. So I just want to finish on just reading the news at the moment, which I think underlines both the nervousness and what I talked about was how complex network systems, the bigger they grow, the bigger the risks of a collapse or a cascades taking place in them. And this is the news. Goldman Sachs warns that if the short squeeze continues, the entire market could crash. Unsustainable excess in one small part of the market has the potential to tip a row of dominoes and create broader turmoil. I mean, God, if just a few of those Reddit, 100,000 plus of those Reddit people have produced this. I mean, the vulnerability of this complex system is very obvious. Mm-hmm. Mohammad. Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly. So they don't necessarily have to go to the streets. They can just go to Wall Street and buy a few shares.
Guys, sorry, just 30 seconds, but I submit to all of you something very important as well, which is a subplot of the GameStop thing. Do you know who profit a lot from it in terms of billions of dollars? We don't know how many yet. BlackRock. So BlackRock was on it yes, from the beginning. That's the major subplot of the story.
Yeah.
So, Max, what do you have to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the short squeeze tactic, which is part of the democratized investment, is it's not going to be able to take down Wall Street. And BlackRock is clearly playing both sides, so there are going to be many big investors who are going to get involved on the side of the short squeeze, and that's just the reality. But Melvin Capital, in one of the firms that was carrying out these naked shorts, of GameStop and just basically bets on the failure of companies and the failure of America and makes billions of dollars as U.S. workers lose trillions, has lost over 50% of its own capital in January alone. So the tactic has, and as I said, many of the people involved in this are deeply ideological and extremely, extremely angry. I guess I just wanted to make 2 points about where the U.S. is going. A point about liberalism, because Mohammad has brought it up several times, the failure of liberalism. Liberalism used to mean something. It used to mean something to me. I was raised in a very liberal environment in Washington, and liberalism to me, and the way I understood it, it meant FDR and the New Deal, massive government intervention to prevent an economy from collapsing, and of course to angry American public from turning towards communist insurrection. It meant to me John F. Kennedy and the secret diplomacy he carried out with Nikita Khrushchev, his partner in Moscow, his taking on of the Joint Chiefs over the Bay of Pigs and preventing a preemptive nuclear strike on Cuba, his speech at American University weeks before his assassination, warning of the consequences of a Cold War and calling for its end. Liberalism meant to me Lyndon Johnson, who enacted the Great Society, created community colleges, and directed government resources into communities that had been completely ignored, and of course didn't go far enough and found his way into Vietnam. And liberalism has that side of liberalism, of government intervention and diplomacy, has been completely gutted and has been exposed in the Trump era as a hollow fraud. The way that the Biden administration or the Biden campaign ran against Trump was not to promise much to the American public in terms of material change, but to simply say, I am just not Donald Trump. And then we saw who
fundamentally change.
Exactly. And Biden said nothing. He promised nothing will fundamentally change. But who is he speaking to there? I mean, this is, smoke-filled room talk. He's speaking to the donor class that really controls the Democratic Party, where the used to be some of the primary donors. Now it's corporate America. How was the campaign? How did it play out? It didn't play out through Biden giving charismatic speeches. We barely saw Biden, just as we barely see him now. What we saw was big tech run push notifications endlessly on the social media platforms where so much of the millennial and younger Americans live, and all Americans basically exist there as they're stuck on their screens at home, telling them to vote. It was just this festival of vote propaganda, and the subtext was vote against Trump. Google, you did a Google search, it would tell you to vote. People were all wearing masks in affluent neighborhoods in Washington that said vote. I don't know what happened to those masks. Now they all say unity. Celebrities were everywhere telling you to vote. Celebrities were, the true spokespeople of the Biden campaign, along with the military intelligence apparatus, which had ran the Russiagate campaign, calling Trump a traitor and promising that Biden would restore control and bring back the American way of life, which so many who live on the coasts are deeply invested in. And this is and then of course, then you have the sort of the Davos transatlantic elites who are sending a strong message that Biden will restore our alliances. And liberals have been told that NATO is this important institution. They no longer support peace and diplomacy with countries that are seen as adversaries. So this is the sad situation of American liberalism, where Biden made one real promise to deliver something material to the American public, which was a $2,000 single stimulus check, just once. He promised that, and he said, if you elect these two senators from Georgia as Democrats, we will have the votes in the Senate needed to get you that $2,000 stimulus check. And now Biden has said, well, immediately, like on day one.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's pathetic. Just $2,000. That's not enough considering what we've lost. But that's what people were willing to accept to make this, to support him. And now it's $1,400. And they said, well, the $600 that Trump sent you was a down payment, and 600 plus 1,400 equals 2,000. So we actually kept our promise. As the Democratic Party and the liberal establishment is unable to produce any material change for the American public, there will be this 70 million or so Americans, this sector, that will reject violently the agenda of the what they would call the deep state, which could mean anything from celebrities in Hollywood to big tech to U.S. intelligence. And that will define the cultural conflict that will burn, not just simmer, but burn throughout the Biden era. And so I think we've spent the whole time talking about foreign policy and international politics, but this is going to be a very domestic focused administration, even though the president has the most experience in foreign policy of any president since George Herbert Walker Bush. And as a token of its domestic focus, one of the most mediocre foreign policy minds of our generation, Susan Rice, has been appointed to domestic policy director. So the domestic crisis of the U.S. will dictate its performance on the world stage, and that's where the next 4 years of this will be focused.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much. I think that there's a lot yet to be said. I think we were only touching on the beginning of all sorts of different topics. But I think that that's exactly why Iran and the Russians and everyone is looking so carefully at the United States. And the United States, the government and the elites don't recognize that people are watching. And the United States, what Alastair was, alluding to when he spoke about whether the U.S. elections were fraudulent or not, is completely irrelevant. People saw it as rigged, where big tech was siding with one side, and that's not what the Americans told the rest of the world how they conduct their affairs. People were watching as one side was being silenced online and the other side was being promoted day and night by the power, by what is often called the deep state. And that sort of goes back to what we were saying earlier about U.S. soft power and how that has been diminished. So, but as the United States looks inward, that basically means that those powers abroad will have more space for maneuver. And if the United States was smart, what they would do is, at the U.S. government, they would recognize this and try to come to terms with reality. But so far, I think that they are still stuck in their own mythologies, not the sort of mythologies that Alastair was alluding to, but the old mythology of American exceptionalism, where the rest of the world no longer sees the United States as all that exceptional. But the United States is moving into what I think is a sort of dark tunnel. And while I agree that Wall Street is not going to fall at the hands of these young traders or ordinary Americans, but what it is going to do is it's going to make people even more angry, because ultimately I think Wall Street will come out on top, and this will just be yet another defeat for ordinary Americans who've lost so much over the last decade, especially since 2008. But I think, as we all know, it goes far before that. But the speed in which the decline has increased after 2008, I think, is phenomenal. In any case, I'm very grateful to the three of you, Alastair, Crooke from Conflicts Forum, Max Blumenthal, the Grayzone. We spoke about the green zone and the red zone and the blue zone. And the blue zone. But make sure you read the Grayzone, and Pepe, whose works we read everywhere, including in Asia Times. Three of the best people to follow and whether it's online or whether you are able to have them on your forums, I would definitely watch. And again, I'm very grateful to all of you and to my colleagues who've arranged for this organization, who've organized this panel, and who've arranged for our guests to come together. Thank you all very much, and hopefully we'll meet again soon. I think there'll be a lot to cover in the coming weeks and months, so hopefully there'll be many opportunities for us to continue our discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammad.
Thank you, Mohammad.
I hope
Mohammad. That was brilliant. Thank you, guys.
And when you have to face the music of your boss for overrunning, we wish you good luck.
Yeah, I'll be in hiding for the next few weeks. And one final thing that I'd like to point out, and that while I'm not a fan of Iranian television, but when you watch American television now, Iranian television looks
pretty
good.
Pretty good.
It's amazing what's going on in the United States, and the irony is that these people don't see it. They don't see, like, they're shutting down people's voices, but they don't see the irony of it all. But in any case, hopefully people across the world will see better days ahead, no matter what happens in the immediate future. We all live in hope. And I also hope to see the three of you all soon. Thank you very much.
Hope to see you in person someday. Thanks.
Soon, hopefully.
Happy dystopia, everybody. And remember, we will own nothing.
Bye for now.
Great. Bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Bye.